Hey, School Bus here. Today we have the second installment in the series History versus World of Tanks. Counting cats. What's this school bus guy on about? Well, we're going to look at today what came to be known as the German tank problem. You can go out and check it out on Google. And it has to do with, in the intelligence gathering leading up to D-Day, the Allies had conflicting information. And so they needed to combine their traditional intelligence gathering with statistics. And today we're going to throw in a little World of Tanks in the background at least, and talk a little bit about how the German tank problem and this issue of tank quantities, how does that affect the gameplay in World of Tanks? So, let's go check it out. We'll see if you stick it out to the end. I know. So throughout the war, the Western Allies were always very keenly interested in how many enemy tanks were there, particularly the Germans, where were they being produced, and what types of tanks were out there. And when we come to the Panther tank, they had experienced it in Italy, and also went by the name Panzer V, or Panzer V. And although they had found it to be a pretty rough tank to come up against, they didn't see them in very large numbers. And so as planning was happening for D-Day, they weren't expecting there to be many. They were expecting the Shermans to continue to trounce all over the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, which is kind of similar to what we see in World of Tanks, isn't it? But very shortly before D-Day, rumors began to surface that there was a large population of these Panzer V Panther tanks, and that concerned the Allied planners a lot, and they needed to come up with a way to be able to figure out how many were there. And so there were a couple of techniques they were able to use. One was their traditional means, which was the one that had kind of given them an awfully high number. Another method was to do it statistically, and we'll come back to that. And then yet another technique was to analyze the road wheels on the tanks and use unique features to the castings to be able to make a determination of the population. And we'll come back to that one as well. So to do this, they were able to use a couple of bits of information they had. One was they were able to look at the captured tanks and discovered that there were part number serializations happening on some of the components. The most reliable one and easiest one for them to interpret was that on the gearboxes, that there looked to be a pretty simple serialization sequence that could be watched, so they knew what serial number tanks they had and what order they were made in. So that was one bit of information they had. And the other was to use the road wheels. So on the road wheels, when you're casting those, or really with anything that you're casting, the particular mold you're using may have unique characteristics, particularly ones that are hastily thrown together during wartime, in which case when you look at the lines, the parting lines in the mold, or various deformities and characteristics, you can begin to estimate how many different molds are being used. Once you know how many molds are being used, then using general understanding of metallurgy and cooling times, you can begin to figure out, okay, in a given day, you'd be able to make this many, so many days in a month, and next thing you know, you have a monthly production figure. So using those two methods independently, they were able to begin to put together an assessment that wasn't based on the traditional means of using aerial flyovers, interrogating people, whatever they might try and use. So for the road wheel analysis, they took the wheels from two different tanks, which was a total of 64 wheels, 32 per tank, and they looked for unique characteristics in the molds. And they found that looking at those various characteristics of the parting lines, etc., that there were a certain number of molds. I don't know how many they determined it to be, but they took that estimated quantity and they sat down with some English manufacturers that had experience with casting road wheels, and they came up with an estimate of 270 tanks that could be produced per month using that number of molds. And history shows that the actual number during that month would have been 276, so they were off by 6. That is pretty damn impressive. Meanwhile, the statisticians, the mathematicians, sat down and they used 2 different statistical methods, one being the frequentist approach and the other one being the Bayesian analysis, and using those they came up with a number. Now unfortunately I can't find specific numbers where it was the road wheel calculation versus the statistical method, but what we can see is in this chart here we can see what came up from the statistical method versus what was being done with the conventional intelligence of the time versus what was being reported after the war, which we kind of consider to be the correct answer. We can see the statistical estimate for June 1941, for example, was 244, the intelligence said 1500, and the German record said 271. So, win statistics. So back to their original goal, the original estimates coming out of the other war campaigns was incorrect. There were definitely going to be more Panthers than they saw there, but there were definitely not the huge production numbers that had been feared based on those last-minute intelligence gatherings. So how did history pan out? How many Panthers were there, and how many Shermans were there? So here we have a visual representation of the tank populations. So we have the Panther tank here in the blue, and we have the Sherman tank here in the orange. And so, as you can obviously see, there is a large discrepancy here. And this is using the historical figures that approximately you have 6,000 Panthers that were produced during the war, and then you have close to 50,000. I think actually I have graphed here 49,000 Sherman tanks. It was 49,300 was the total. So that's an 8-to-1 ratio of Shermans to Panthers. And I don't think we could argue that the Panther was 8 times better. And when I plotted this, I couldn't help but think of Return of the King, where they're in the final battle, and you've got Aragorn and his forces are in blue, and then you have all of the Mordor fighters around. So, short of destroying the One Ring that controlled the Allies, Germany was kind of screwed. Did you ever watch that TV show Animaniacs? At the end of every episode, they'd always have this kind of what we've learned, the moral of the story. Well, let's get to the moral of the story here. So wars aren't necessarily won by the best vehicles on the battlefield. Sometimes they're just won by the vehicle that there's more of. And don't even get me started on the T-34s, because those populations dwarf the Shermans. We're talking 80,000 tanks for the T-34s. Maybe I'll do something in the future on the T-34, depending on the reception of this video. But the Allies had such a strong production backing them that the support that they had, the interchangeability of parts, the reliability of the Sherman tank versus the Panther, which we didn't even get into here, also played into this. So the fact that there were only 6,000 of them, that was just the beginning of the problem. And so there is a distinct difference between World of Tanks and a real war in that in tanks we have 15 versus 15 or 30 versus 30 in the grand battles, and that plays out differently in reality. And you could say, well, tanks could do something where you would have these disproportionate quantities of tanks depending on the quality of them, but that has its own problems beyond some of the issues we have today with tank balancing. So I hope you found this kind of informative and educational. I know when I first heard the story of this, it definitely perked my curiosity, and definitely want to share it. If you enjoy this video, please click that like button and go check out some of the rest of the channel. If you like it, click that subscribe button. We're just over 50 subscribers. I'd love to see it get to 100. For those of you leaving comments, clicking that like button, hitting subscribe, thank you very, very much. Have a great day.